Problems are not stop signs, they are guidelines. So as I talked about in part one of this two-part video series about candle making problems and how to address them, I alluded to the fact that for what seems like such a simple product, candles are actually quite complex. There's a lot that goes into them and a lot of problems that can arise when making them. And by problems, what I really mean is areas to improve. So once again, problems are not stop signs. They're just guidelines. Problems should not discourage you from moving forward. They should not convince you to give up. Problems just tell you what to work on to improve. Problems create focus. Hi everyone, my name is Wade Thomas. I'm the owner of Black Tie Barn Candle Company. I also run this YouTube channel, which is dedicated to helping other candle makers not only learn how to make candles and wax melts, but also how to run a candle business. So whether you're here for a hobby or for a business, please stay tuned and I really hope you enjoy the content. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in the future and would like to check out future videos or past videos, then just take a couple seconds to give this video a like. Also hit the subscribe button and don't forget to hit the bell icon notification as well. All three of those will help you continue to stay in the loop whenever I post new videos. Also, if you're interested in any other resources, down in the description below, I have links to several good tools, resources, materials, other videos, as well as how you can reach me on other social channels. So be sure to check that out as well. And as always, thank you all for tuning in. And if this is your first time here, I appreciate you stopping by and checking out the channel. So if you are coming here from part one, then this is really just going to pick up where we left off, but we're just going to tackle 7 different candle making issues in this video. If this is the first video you're seeing, I would definitely encourage you to check out part 1 as well, as we tackle 7 other very common candle making problems that new candle makers and experienced candle makers alike often deal with. And the last thing I want to mention real quick before we dive into the specific issues is that just to keep in mind that this is an overview video. If I were to go into very deep details on every one of these issues, we would be here all day. So I will have future videos dedicated to these problems specifically. But with that being said, this will still be a pretty in-depth video talking about 7 different issues that we face as candle makers and little tips and tricks to how to deal with those problems. The first thing we're going to talk about today is cold throw. Now, for any of you brand new candle makers, what cold throw is referring to is the strength of the fragrance you're smelling without the candle being lit. So if you were to take a candle off the shelf, open the lid, and just hold it up close to your nose, how strong of a smelling candle is it without actually lighting the candle? That is called cold throw, or sometimes just the letters CT. First, we should identify why it's so important. Well, cold throw is really kind of the first impression for your customers. Other than seeing the candle on the shelf, so maybe the label or the jar itself would be the very first impression, the first thing that they will actually consider taking that candle home will be the cold throw. If they have trouble smelling your candle off of the shelf, then it doesn't matter how good the candle might burn later and how great the hot throw might be later. And we'll talk about hot throw next, but the key point here is that as a very good first impression, you've got to be able to have a detectable scent in the candle. It doesn't have to be extremely strong, but if it's so faint the customer doesn't even want to take it home, then you're going to have problems. It doesn't matter how great a candle is if your customer never takes it home to burn it. So first impressions are important, and cold throw goes a long way to help build those first impressions from a positive perspective. So what are a few things you can do to help that? Well, first and foremost, you have to consider your wax type. Every wax has pros and cons. Some relate to the cold throw and hot throw. Some are easier to wick. Some are easier to source. Some hold color better. There's a lot of different factors that go into determining a wax type. I have another video on the channel, which I'll link above, that discusses these other wax types, at least some common ones that new candle makers like to begin with. And it goes into details about the pros and cons of each. But one of the pros and cons of different waxes is the cold throw. The thing that affects cold throw is your fragrance oil and the fragrance oil quality. If you're buying your fragrance oils from a reputable candle supplier, chances are you're getting a good quality fragrance oil. But if you are sourcing your fragrance oils from Amazon and you don't know who the manufacturer is and you aren't quite sure where the oils are coming from, it's harder to have a trust relationship or a trust factor when buying those oils. And if you get oils that are not particularly very complex or concentrated, then you might have weaker cold throw. So my advice here would be to stick with reputable reputable candle supplies, not cannibal supplies, that would be a disaster, but candle supplies, and you will most likely be working with good quality oils. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of cold throw is whether or not you should be lidding your jars while they are curing. And by this, what I'm referring to is while the candles are settling up and firming up after you've poured them, should you go ahead and put the jar lid on earlier? Well, truth be told, yes, it can have an impact, but it's not something you should be doing intentionally just to control the cold throw. There are other things that you need to be considering when you're working on candle making and when you should lid your jars. The number one reason to put a lid on your jar when you can is to keep out dust and debris. But it can have a benefit a little bit of keeping in some cold throw. And how does that work? Well, it doesn't actually affect the fragrance oil in the wax whatsoever. Fragrance oil will escape from a jar whether the lid is on or not. However, because the lid is on, that fragrance actually kind of gets trapped into the lid itself. That's why you see often recommended if you're going to sample a candle on the shelf, don't stick your nose in the candle, take the lid off and smell that because you get a more accurate representation of what it's going to smell like in the air. It's not quite as concentrated. The reason that works is because that fragrance is kind of trapped on the jar. Same thing as when you put on perfume or cologne. Even if you put it on your skin later on in the day when you take off your clothes and you're going to do laundry, you might smell your fragrance on your clothes. So yeah, putting a lid on your candle earlier doesn't change the amount of fragrance or anything like that, but what it does is kind of trap it into the lid, and sometimes that can enhance your cold throw. So just something to consider. Also, you have to be careful when you put on your lid, because if you're using any kind of wick centering tools or any devices like that, you wouldn't really be able to put the lid over that. You would have to wait until you've been able to trim your wick. So my advice is stick to your normal processes, but then just put your lid on as soon as you can. Oh, and one other thing that I have to mention when it comes to cold throw, there's a lot of advice out there about changing your pour temperature, and that could affect or help your cold throw. That's very debatable. You could ask 3 different people and get 3 different answers on whether that's true. One might say yes, one might say no, and one says, I have no idea. And that's really the best answer, is sometimes you might think it helps, sometimes it may not, but you should never really change your process and your pour temperatures only for a specific reason of enhancing cold throw. There are so many other things that you have to consider with candle making: hot throw, wicking, fragrance retention, the aesthetics of your candle. There are so many things that can change. It's like a butterfly effect. If you change one part of your process, it's going to have an impact on everything else. So I would caution you on changing your pour temperature just to try to help cold throw. The theory out there, though, is that by pouring at a low temperature or adding your oils at a lower temperature, you'll end up with better cold throw. Again, that's very debatable. Some say yes, some say no. But I would stick to the manufacturer's recommendations on when you add your fragrance oil and the temperature you pour. Because if you refer back to part 1 of this video series, most of that video really talked about all the different impacts that changing your pour temperature can have, and why finding that good pour temperature sweet spot will solve a lot of your problems. Well, now if you go change that just to deal with the cold throw, you're kind of starting all over, and you're risking several other problems happening by adjusting your cold throw. So yes, depending on the type of wax, it may help, and you can most certainly experiment with that, but it just wouldn't be my #1 concern. Now let's talk about hot throw. Now this is arguably most important. Yes, first impressions are important to get your candles in the hands of your customers, but your customers will never come back if your candle doesn't have good hot throw and it doesn't perform well. So hot throw, if you're brand new, is actually the strength of your fragrance while the candle's burning. So what contributes to good hot throw? Well, first and foremost is wax type. Certain waxes by default are better at throwing fragrance in the air than others. It is generally accepted that paraffin has the best overall fragrance throw simply because of the molecular structure of paraffin wax. It's easier for the fragrance to escape into the air. Soy, on the other hand, it has a different molecular structure and it doesn't release fragrance quite as easily. That's why it requires usually a larger or hotter burning wick to get a good hot throw with soy. So it doesn't mean that you can't get good hot throw or comparable hot throws between different waxes. It just means by default in their native state, one of them is a little bit better at releasing hot throw than others, and the others sometimes require a little bit more work. So the first answer to that question is your wax type. It is easier to get good hot throw with certain waxes than it is others. However, it's not just about the wax type. It can also be about the jar size, and often that's kind of the #1 way to increase your hot throw. Smaller, skinnier jars are not going to have as much hot throw as a larger, wider jar, and that's simply because the melt pool is bigger as you increase the jar size. The melt pool is essentially what's really releasing the 95% of that fragrance into the air. It's not the actual wick that's doing it. It's actually the melt pool that's being generated by lighting the candle. The larger the melt pool, the stronger the scent throw. So that is why jars like 2-wick jars and 3-wick jars that are much larger in diameter and get a bigger, faster melt pool will give you better hot throw. Another one is fragrance quality. We talked about fragrance oil quality in the previous problem, talking about cold throw, and the same thing applies, if not more so, when we're talking about hot throw. You need fragrance oils that were designed for candle making. You want them concentrated. You want them high quality, and the more complex generally is better. Those are going to provide better results and better fragrance throw most of the time. But it's not just necessarily about the quality of the fragrance, it could be the type of fragrance oil. For example, some florals can be very light, while some bakery scents can be very rich. So certain fragrance oils can be lighter or heavier than one another just because of the type of fragrance oil it is. And that's why it's important to test samples of fragrance oils first to make sure it's going to perform the way you want. I have lower fragrance loads in some of my candles just because that particular fragrance is a much stronger, more potent fragrance. On the other hand, I have some that are a little bit weaker than average, so I have to use a little bit more sometimes to kind of get the results I'm looking for. But generally speaking, you're looking for good quality oils and oils that are strong without having to use too much fragrance oil. And of course, when we talk about hot throw, we have to talk about wicking. It is very, very important to have proper wicking. Now, I have a whole video all about wicks that I will link above as well, that goes really into the weeds about how to wick a candle properly and the things you should be considering when you're wicking a candle. It talks about the theory of wicking, why it's important, how it works, and also some tips on what wicks to kind of start off with for different types of waxes. So I'm not going to go into too many details in this video about wicking, but just know that wicking is very important. If you don't find the right type and right size of wick for your candle, then you're not going to have the hot throw that you could achieve if you're using the optimal wick choice. Now, here's another tip for hot throw. If you're having hot throw inconsistencies, for example, maybe you have excellent hot throw at the beginning of your candle, and then as you get further down the candle, it's not as strong or as potent as it once was. Well, that can happen for two reasons. Sometimes it can just be overwicked, but also, here's a little tip. There's a product on the market called Vybar, V-Y-B-A-R. Again, I have another video all about Vybar specifically. I will link that into this video as well. Vybar is actually not created to help with hot throw. However, it does have some benefits that can help achieve that. Vybar is actually a hardener, and it's meant to take super soft waxes and add a little bit of firmness to them, but it also evenly distributes other materials and ingredients in your wax. So if you're using dye, it will help evenly distribute the dye. It does the same thing with fragrance oil. So often when candle makers add fragrance oils to their wax, depending on the type of wax they're using and depending on when they added their oil and how well they blended, it doesn't necessarily get distributed evenly throughout the body of your candle. Vybar really helps that fact. So you should end up with better distribution of oil throughout the entirety of your candle. However, that's not the only reason. Vybar will actually allow you to hold your wax to hold a little bit more fragrance. It increases the capacity of your fragrance by opening up the molecules a little bit more, and then it kind of traps them in and tightens them in. That will allow you to add a little bit more oil if necessary. And I say that very intentionally because most candles waxes already hold plenty of oil and you don't really need to add more. However, there are some waxes on the market that only hold 3, 5, 6% of fragrance oil, and in order to add more oil to them, you will have to use a little bit of Vybar, which will help increase the capacity of oil in that wax. Now, we're going to talk about some other benefits of Vybar here in a few minutes, but again, if you're interested more on this topic, check out that video. It will go into a lot more detail. Last note on Vybar though, make sure you know your wax already. If that wax that you're using already has Vybar, you do not want to add any more. Adding too much Vybar actually can have some negative side effects, like trapping in fragrance so much that it actually hinders the ability for your candle to have good hot throw. So definitely do your research and make sure that wax you're using does not already have Vybar. Most soy waxes on the market do not, so if you're using soy, chances are you're probably good to go. However, many parasoy blends and paraffin waxes do already have Vybar, so you should definitely check with a supplier or manufacturer before adding any additional. Now real quick, I want to address the idea of pour temperature and hot throw. There are some claims made that by pouring your candle at a lower temperature, pouring the wax at a lower temperature into the jar will increase your hot throw. The basis for that argument is if you pour your candle at a lower temperature, it will firm up quicker, which means it's less time while the candle is settling for the fragrance to escape into the air. Well, for starters, the amount of fragrance escaping into the air after you pour it is so minute that it's not even going to be detectable. It's also part of the normal candle making processes. Candles have been made for ages by pouring at very hot temperatures. So there's no real necessary reason to be pouring at a lower temperature if the goal is better hot throw. It's just not necessary. If you'd like to experiment with that, of course you definitely can. This is coming from personal experience and my conversations with other wax suppliers, wax manufacturers. There is nothing really out there that actually defends or supports pouring at low temperatures to increase hot throw. There are other reasons you may do that, but hot throw should not be a concern or a factor for why you do that. And again, I would refer you back to part 1 of this video series that I talked about pour temperatures. And like I said earlier, changing or altering your pour temperature can really fluctuate and impact several other parts of your candle as well. So just keep that in mind. Good hot throw really just boils down. It's much simpler than we try to make it out to be as candle makers. It really just comes down to a few factors: wax type, fragrance oil, proper wicking. As long as you can nail those, you shouldn't have an issue with hot throw. And if you do, then chances are you might just need to ditch that oil and try a whole new one. The next thing we're going to touch on real quick is about wicks that drown out, drowning wicks. And this is something you'll see generally early on when you're candle making, but as you get more experience, it's less of a problem that you'll deal with. And this is just the problem of as your candle is burning, the wick just tends to kind of die out and fizzle out and not be able to continue burning for the life of your candle. Well, what generally causes that is two things. One is that the candle is just simply underwicked. You might have the wrong wick type, or it might be underwicked, meaning not a large enough size. I would refer you again to that wicking video that goes into a lot more details, but this really just comes down to testing. Testing and proper wicking will eliminate 90% of any drowning wick issues. However, the other major cause for drowning wicks is related to clogging. And in that video I've referenced a few times about wicks, I give a few analogies, metaphors, and examples of how adding other materials into your wax can cause these wicks to clog. So it's important to make sure they understand how the wicking process works. And the wick is sort of like a straw in the fact that it's consuming the fuel, which is the wax and the wax blend, up through the wick, and then it consumes that as fuel to keep the candle lit. If you clog that straw by adding too many other things like too many additives, too much dye, too much fragrance oil, or any other things, foreign elements you might put into your wax blend, that can lead to clogging wicks. If you clog your wick, the wick literally has no fuel or cannot consume fuel, and it eventually may just drown out. It could also mushroom and become a really wild big flame, but either way, that is not a wick that you're looking for. So this is another major cause of drowning wicks. So my advice here is just to work on proper wicking and limit yourself to how many additives you're adding to your candle. Make sure you're using the recommended amount. So let's talk about candle sweating. And I'm referring to the beads, or droplets, or what appears to be some type of moisture on the surface of your candle. However, it's important to identify the two different types of sweating you may see. One is simply your candles being outside. Maybe you're at a craft fair and it's exposed to sunlight and it's literally just starting to melt your candle a little bit. And if that's what's happening, that's completely fine and completely normal. That's not sweating. What I'm referring to is fragrance oil sweating. Basically, it's the oil, your fragrance oil in the candle seeping out onto the surface of your candle. Well, this is a significant problem. For starters, it's a waste and it could affect the way your candle burns, but additionally, it also can become dangerous. If that raw fragrance oil that is pooling at the top of your candle is exposed to the candle flame, that could actually light it on fire. You may have seen some of these videos and posts of candles catching fire on top of the candle itself. While most people want to jump and blame the wax, well, most waxes can't catch fire unless they're at 400 degrees or hotter. That's kind of a general rule out there, but that's the case for most waxes. What causes fires is other elements catching fire. Sometimes people put herbs and things in your candles. That causes them to catch fire. A lot of times it's saturated oils that are now seeping out and settling on the top of the candle. That can catch fire as well. So it's very important to try to avoid this problem. So what causes this oil seepage to happen? Well, there are a few things. The most obvious one is oversaturating your wax with too much fragrance oil. Every wax on the market has a max capacity or a max load of fragrance oil that it can handle. It can be anywhere from 6% up to 12% or even higher on some waxes, but it's important to stay under that amount. I never even like personally to hit the max level. I like to keep mine a little bit lower than the max, simply because I want to leave myself a little variance, a little flexibility, a little wiggle room. Basically, I'm just trying to err on the safe side. So if you add too much fragrance oil and you oversaturate it, the wax literally cannot hold that much. So it's either going to sink to the bottom if it's a heavy oil or rise to the top if it's a light oil, generally speaking. But either way, that's a problem, and the candle oil is escaping from the wax itself. It's no longer one, they've become separate. That is usually an indication of adding too much oil. However, sometimes you can add the proper amount of oil and you still see the same result. That can happen by not properly blending and mixing your wax and oil together, and maybe you did not stir long enough. Maybe you added the oil at too low of a temperature, which is sometimes thrown out there as an idea. I would caution you on that idea as well. Some waxes you can get away with it, but many waxes, if you add the oil at too low of a temperature, it becomes very challenging for them to bind together and become one. And that will cause that oil to kind of always stay somewhat separate from the wax. Now, your wax type can also have an impact on this as well. As I talked about earlier, some waxes are very soft by nature and have low melt points. Those softer waxes will generally hold more oil because they never kind of contract and shrink. Where some waxes, on the other hand, do have a tendency to shrink as they cool. And when a wax shrinks, it contracts, right? So when you pour a liquid candle, it's hot, it's completely expanded, and it's filling up your jars wall to wall, top to bottom. As it starts to cool, it contracts a little bit, can pull away from the side of the jar, can sink a little at the top. You see this in 90% of your waxes out there. And think about what's happening is it goes from fully expanded to contracting and contracting and shrinking and shrinking. Well, what's happening is it's tightening up. The molecules are getting close together. The overall the overall volume of that wax is getting much, much smaller. Well, that means much less room for the oil. So that wax type, especially if you're adding too much oil, can actually, as it's contracting, actually squeeze the oil out of the wax. And that's why often, sometimes you will add fragrance oil and see no problem for several days or even a couple weeks. But then maybe a couple weeks later, you go back and look at your candle and you see that a little bit of oil is actually kind of leached out to the top. And that's because over time, the candle continued to cure and settle and eventually squeezed a little bit of oil that it couldn't handle out of the wax. So the combination of wax type and how much oil you're adding is very, very important. So my advice, follow the recommendations by the manufacturer and the supplier. That's always the best way to start. But I mentioned Vybar earlier to you, and I'll mention it again for this tip as well. As I talked about, the way Vybar allows you to add more fragrance is because not only does it evenly distribute it throughout the whole body of your candle, it also helps kind of restrict or retain it inside of your wax. So if you are having fragrance oil that is seeping out of the wax a little bit, even though you're using the proper amount, consider adding just a little bit of Vybar. That can make all the difference in the world. But again, check out that Vybar video specifically because it talks about the 3 kinds of Vybar that are out there, and it's really important to use the right type of Vybar for your application and your wax, but also how much to use, when to add it, things like that. So I would encourage you to check out that video. All right, let's talk about tunneling. Well, tunneling is another wick problem, like drowning. In fact, it's very similar to drowning. The only real difference between tunneling, a candle tunneling, and a drowning wick is in a tunneling wick, the wick will still continue to burn without drowning out, but it's still too small for the candle, and you're leaving way too much wax on the side of the jar, and it's just tunneling down the middle. Most of the time, you will see this with harder waxes, like palm waxes, hard paraffin waxes, or even very hard soy or parasoy waxes. And that's because they have such a high congealing point that unless you're using the right wick type and it's putting off enough heat, so the right type of wick and the right size of wick, unless it's putting off enough heat to melt the side of the candle and really get a full melt pool, then it's going to continue to tunnel down the middle. And once you tunnel down the middle, there's no real way to fix it without taking some extreme measures on your candle. Generally speaking, this problem is much best if avoided. And so proper wicking, and that means wick type and wick sizing, are very, very important. And then again, consider the type of wax. Remember that harder waxes with a higher congealing point and a higher melting point, you need to make sure that you're maintaining a decent melt pool throughout the life of your candle. However, you could also be tunneling, even though you have the right wick type, for example, but you might have large enough jar that you just need multiple wicks. So you might have a dual wick or a triple wick candle that really requires multiple wicks to be able to properly burn. And if you try to use one wick in that too large of a vessel, you can also end up with tunneling as well. So again, everything goes back to proper wicking when it comes to avoiding issues like tunneling and drowning wicks. So now let's talk about another aesthetic issue. And this is a visual problem, but it does not affect the way the candle burns or performs. But one major issue that brand new candle makers notice right off the bat is kind of these ugly cratered tops of your candles. They either have holes in them, craters, they're real dry, they're rough, they look like cottage cheese. You get all these different descriptions, but to sum it up, we're just going to call them ugly tops. Well, this is most notably related to soy wax. And again, that does not mean that soy wax is bad. I'm not trying to discourage you from that. It's a characteristic of using soy wax. Now, I talked about in part 1 frosting. Well, frosting also happens on the top of your wax, and that's what partially contributes to some of those ugly tops. But you also just might see little dips and craters and rough looking tops when using soy wax. The first thing I would recommend is if you're using soy wax, it's best to just kind of embrace that and understand that it's a characteristic of a soy. Yes, you can mitigate it. Yes, you can make it go away, but oftentimes it will end up coming back when it's no longer in your possession, especially after a customer starts to burn the candle. It can return later is my point. And so I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you are set on using soy wax and you love using soy wax for every other reason, just learn to embrace that one of the characteristics of soy is some of these cratered, rough looking tops occasionally, and just educate your customers. Let them know that, look, this is what a natural candle or a soy candle can do sometimes, and it's completely normal. It's not going to affect the candle burning. So wax type is the #1 contributor to these ugly tops. Another contributor, though, is adding too much fragrance oil. Again, we live in a world now where everyone thinks more is more, and sometimes less is more. And we think that I'm struggling with hot throw, I'm not getting the throw I want, so I'm going to add more oil. Well, more oil doesn't always mean more hot throw, but it can mean more problems. And one of those problems not only is wicking, but also the surface and the look of your candle wax in general. Too much oil can cause some weird things to happen with soy wax. So once again, use the proper amount of oil, test different fragrance loads and different pour temperatures and different wicks, and all these different factors that can all lead to ugly tops. Don't overly concern yourself with this unless it's just really bothering you the way it looks. And if that's the case, you may have to sample some other waxes or work on some of these things I mentioned and tweak those a little bit to see if you can get some better results. One thing that people do try with these ugly tops is once they have their candle completely done and it's firmed up and cured, and they'll hit it with a heat gun. So at a low temperature, they'll hold the heat gun above, and I've mentioned this in a few other videos. So what they'll do is just melt the top layer of the wax. You only need to melt it a little bit, maybe just have a melt pool, just maybe a 1/4 inch at most, probably 1/8 of an inch is plenty. And if you smooth it out like that, that will help the top layer of the candle look much better. But again, it's probably important to mention on your website or your care cards or your packaging or just to your customers directly that the problem with those ugly tops will generally come back later as they start burning the candle. So it's better to inform everyone that that's a characteristic of the wax you're using, and that way it doesn't concern them if it returns later on. So last thing we're going to talk about today is another wicking issue, and it's too much smoke and excess soot. So all candles can smut. So all waxes can, all candles can smoke and all candles can soot. The difference is an acceptable amount versus an unacceptable amount. Well, let's start off with what causes that soot and smoke, at least visually. Well, as I said, anything that burns can smoke and soot for the most part, and that includes every type of wax. However, you will see the black soot and smoke more associated with paraffin waxes for a couple reasons, but it's not the ones you might always be thinking of. There's a lot of information and competing information out there about different wax types, some myth, some factual. But one thing is fact, and that is even soy candles can soot. It's just the difference is it's a kind of lightish grayish or whitish color smoke and soot, as opposed to when you're using paraffin, it's a dark gray or black. For that reason, most of the time you see soot and smoke issues, it's usually pertaining to a paraffin candle. But what causes excess soot and smoke is really not the wax type itself. It's actually incomplete combustion. It's a problem with the wicking or the overall combination of everything going on in that candle. It really is a culmination of everything involved. The jar size, the wax, the fragrance oil, the wick, any additives you're using, all of those together work to make this recipe, to make this blend. And if everything is not optimal, you're going to have some sputtering, soot and smoke, things like that. And so it's really important to just dial in your process. That is the #1 way to avoid smoke and soot, is to dial in your process and just make the best burning candle you possibly can. Sounds easier said than done, I know, but that is really the best way to tackle this problem. A few tips is wick sizing. You generally want to use the smallest wick size possible while still getting a good burn on your candle. If your candle's overwicked at all, you're going to get some excess smoke and some excess soot, because larger wicks create a combustion issue, and sometimes it's trying to consume more wax, more fuel they can actually use, and that will cause them to dance and jump around, causing smoke, or it can lead to carbon buildup and incomplete combustion, which is the soot that you're seeing flicker off of the wick itself and hit the side of your jar. All of these things are related to improper sizing or wrong wick type. Some waxes require a different wick type to really optimally burn, so it's important to get wicking dialed in. Again, wicking and testing, I talk about it all the time, because you can avoid most candle making problems by just dialing in a good process to make an optimal burning candle. Jar shape is another thing that can lead to excess soot on the side of your candle jars. Wider vessels that do not have any kind of lip or shoulder on them, those are going to have less soot problems because there's more room in that jar for the soot to kind of escape, or the airflow not to compete with each other. And so it's easier to wick those jars generally with multiple wicks, and there's no shoulder. They're so much wider that it's much more difficult for the soot to stick to the side of the jar. Smaller, more narrow jars, or particularly jars that have a lip on them or a shoulder on them, are much more susceptible to getting that soot trapped on the side of the jar. So it's not so much that one jar causes more soot than the other, it's just that one of them, it's easier for that soot to collect on the side of the jar, so it makes it more noticeable. So jar size can play another important factor in whether or not you're getting detectable soot on the side of your jars. Now, another factor to consider when you're having smoke or sooting issues is your fragrance oil. Yes, I would use high quality fragrance oils, but it's also the amount that is worth talking about as well. I've talked a few times about not using too much fragrance oil, that you really need to find that happy medium. It's best to use the least amount of fragrance oil possible to get the results that you're after. So I don't mean to say use such a little fragrance oil that you can barely detect it, but if you can get a good level of fragrance oil in your candle that makes your candle smell great, while also not oversaturating or causing wicking issues, that would be the best of both worlds, right? Well, adding too much fragrance oil, again, as I talked about with the wax blend being a culmination of all these different materials working together, if you add too much fragrance oil, you're really kind of throwing off the mojo of the wax blend, right? You're adding too much of something that it can either clog the wick, or it changes the overall blend of your wax so much that it affects your wicking. The more oil you add, generally you're introducing the risk for more wicking problems. And too much oil can definitely cause some excess soot and smoke coming from the wick. But on a similar note, it doesn't have to be just too much fragrance oil. Any other additives that you add too much of can contribute to wicking issues, including incomplete combustion and soot. And that is, for example, adding too much dye. So whatever you're using in your candle, the simple recommendation is just to stick to whatever the guidelines and specifications are from the supplier and the manufacturer. That will save you from most of your problems. Another contributor, however, sometimes to smoke and soot on your candle is not something you can control as much, and it's not your fault either. And that is related to drafts. If someone is burning a candle in a drafty area of their house, near a vent, or the air AC is on in the house, those create little drafts. Those drafts can cause your flame to kind of bounce back and forth, and you'll see that kind of sputter some smoke and soot occasionally. That does not indicate a problem with your candle. It just might indicate a problem with where the candle is burning. So I don't want you to over-focus on situations like that, because most of the time, it's not something you can control, particularly obviously if it's a customer's house. So my advice is just to also put on your website and your FAQs, something like that, that try to avoid drafty areas when burning a candle. And the last kind of bonus tip when it comes to avoiding smoke and soot, and many of you might already be familiar with this, some of you may not, and that is a candle topper. If you're not familiar with what a candle topper is it's kind of like a lid for your candle, except for it's got intentionally placed slits, slots, or holes on that lid. And what that help does is regulate airflow. There's a lot of science that goes into why that's happening, but without that, you just got this open vessel and you've got air trying to come in and air trying to escape, and that can cause some drafts and some competing airflow, and that can cause your wick to kind of bounce and all over the place, right? And that will cause some smoke and soot to emit from the candle. However, what a candle topper does is you set it right on top, it helps regulates the airflow. So it's certain spots for the air to come in and certain spots to go out. Most of these candle toppers are also decorative, so they're very common around like holidays. But if you're not familiar with them, I'll try to remember to put a link in the video description, but you can also Google them too. But candle toppers are really neat. I used to sell these kind of basic metal black ones with some of my candle orders, just as kind of a little gift or bonus. But it is really neat if you've never used one. It's really interesting to watch. You know, get a candle and light it and watch, especially if the flame's like further down in the jar where they tend to dance a little bit more. Watch the flame just kind of be bouncing and bouncing like this. And as soon as you put a candle topper on, it's kind of neat. It's really interesting how that works. But that's essentially what they are. They're airflow regulators. All right, so everyone, that wraps up these additional 7 common candle making problems and some tips and tricks on how to deal with them. Again, check out part 1 if you haven't already. And again, check out all the other videos I've linked above in the description, or also just subscribe to the channel and you can check out all the videos on the channel. But I hope this information was helpful for many of you out there. I would be interested in hearing in the comment section what some of your biggest struggles are when it comes to candle making, and any tips and tricks you've found that help deal with those as well. I really enjoy putting these videos together. I really enjoy the content working on this video. I put a lot of time and energy into these. So again, if you wouldn't mind, hit the like button, hit subscribe. But I also want to leave you with a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, especially pertaining to this industry. I don't remember who said it. I'll try to find out and put it in the description. But the quote is this: "Problems are nothing but a wake-up call for creativity." I love that quote because it should just remind you and make you feel a little bit better that if I run into a problem, it doesn't mean the end. That doesn't mean I should give up. That doesn't mean that I've failed. It just is an indicator of I need to try something new. I've ran into a problem. This is a chance to get my creative juices flowing and come up with solutions to that problem. We all deal with candle making issues, all of us. New candle makers, experienced candle makers alike. We all have had these problems. And if a candle maker tells you they haven't, they're either lying or they just don't know yet. But I don't want you to feel alone, like you're on some kind of island and you're the only one dealing with these problems. We all face these problems. It does not mean you're not a good candle maker. Problems are just a roadmap to help us create better candles. So I will leave you all with that. I appreciate you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.